Good afternoon. I'm Ray Sarnacki, a citizen scientist working with the Smithsonian Environmental Archaeology Lab in Edgewater, Maryland. Jim Gibb, the archaeologist who heads the lab, is my co-author. What strategies did farmers employ in Anne Arundel County during the late 19th century? How did soil conditions, topography, and other geographic conditions affect their decisions? These are just two of the questions we're attempting to answer by creating a regional database of these factors using GIS. Our geographic focus is on the first election district, situated just east of Washington, D.C. and a little south of Baltimore. Our period of interest is the late 19th century between 1850 and 1880, which coincides with the agricultural census data that provides crop yields by farm. It was a period of significant change for agriculture, making it an interesting period to research. Prior to the Civil War, tobacco was the main cash crop in this area. Its economical production relied heavily on slave labor in large dispersed plantations. Production of tobacco peaked just prior to the war. Years of constant tobacco cultivation caused soil depletion, making it less economical to produce. Following the Civil War, the abolition of slavery and opening of lands west of Maryland meant plantation owners had to find less labor-intensive crops, such as grains and raising livestock, for their livelihood. Some hired farmhands to replace slave labor. Others decided to lease their land to tenants or sharecroppers. Our presentation today starts with an overview of our project concept and the software to implement it. Next, we'll discuss a case study involving a 580-acre tract located in the western end of the first district. Finally, we'll look at what we've learned along the way in our plans to move forward. The first step involves creating a multi-layer geospatial model of each farm's physical characteristics and their crop production. Layers in this model are logical collections of geographic data for analysis based on the attributes of each feature in the layer. These layers interlock in that they are all georeferenced to a real geographic physical space. The data consists of vector and raster imagery from various sources, each with a set of tabular data describing the attributes and geometric dimensions of various features. Relational database management software allows for data management and queries for analysis. Data for our project is comprehensive and, as I said, comes from a number of sources. The starting point includes historical maps and deeds, surveyor plats, available at the Maryland State Archives. The availability of open source software is what makes all of this possible and affordable. Except for Excel, the software we chose for our project is open source. Not only are they free, but we have found them to be robust tools for archaeology. Support for them has been extremely good. Training is readily available for a nominal cost, or in many cases, free on YouTube. QGIS is at the heart of our project. It allows us to visualize, manage, edit, and analyze data. It also interacts well with all the other supporting software we use for data preparation, in this case, as well as for analysis, which includes PostGIS in RStudio for statistical work. Let's look at how we're implementing this vision in our pilot project. Our initial study looks at the determining factors of farm strategies and developing a typology of farms to categorize them. Once we establish a meaningful sample size, we can begin exploring numerous other questions that involve variability among farms during this period, and their social, political, and ecological implications, all of which can play a role in forming future archaeological surveys. That's the vision of where we want to take this project. Now let's look at how we're doing it. Recreating plats is our first step, and it involves searching the Maryland Land Record Archives to identify deeds and owners during the period. Once we've searched the title for a parcel back to the proper period, we transcribe the meets and bounds using an Excel spreadsheet and import that result into a CAD program. In this case, we use LibreCAD. The resulting vector polygon is then imported to QGIS for georeferencing on the current tax map. So far, we've recreated more than 100 deeds across a wide geographic and temporal spread. Once we've recreated a set of deeds, we assemble them into farms and as they existed in the census period. This is a very labor-intensive effort, so for practical purposes, we limited the initial scope to farms in the 1870 census. Let's look at one example of a plat, starting with Hopkins' 1878 historical map depicting landholders during this period. These maps were subscription-based and landowners had to pay to have their names included. They lack detail, but are helpful in locating the general area of individual land holdings. For today's purpose, we're going to look at a 580-acre tract known as Rowdown in the area highlighted here. It belonged to William Brogden's family as far back as 1742. By 1878, the land was owned by Benjamin Phipps, Richard Weems, and Mary Brogden, the widow of William. This slide shows the plat of Dr. William Brogden's land holdings at the time of his death. William Brogden originally obtained this land from his father's estate in 1849 and held it until his death in 1864. William's personal estate was insolvent at the time of his death. To cover his debts, court-appointed trustees broke up the estate, and you can see the various lots that were included in that. Two dower tracts, Dower A and Dower B, totaling 112 acres, were set aside for Mary. This screenshot shows the tracts as sold by the trustees, which we georeferenced into QGIS from meets and bounds descriptions using the process that I explained earlier. One sold to Dr. Richard Weems, 177 acres, and the other to Benjamin Phipps, 183 acres. In addition to the dower, Mary purchased an additional 108 plus acres, giving her a total of 220 acres, which she held until her death in the mid-1890s. Overlaying the soil characteristics on the plat, we start to see some interesting things appear. This slide delineates the area by farmland category as classified by the USDA and the state of Maryland. Soil quality, growing season, moisture supply are just some of the major factors used in this determination, along with slope that ranges mainly between 0 and 6% for farmland. The various farmland types are noted in the keys shown in the lower right here. Prime farmland, the area in sort of a bluish purple, is designated by the USDA, while farmland of statewide importance in the deeper purple is delineated by criteria determined by, in this case, Maryland state agencies. The area in orange requires irrigation in order to be used as prime farmland. Notice the variation in soil across the tract as we go from west to east. Using QGIS, we can eventually add the area in each of these smaller polygons to be able to compare the tracts. Looking at topography, we notice a similar pattern, starting with Phipps' relatively flat area in the west, changing to rolling hills as we move eastward. As it turns out, these features seem to have played a role in determining farming strategies of the individuals who relied on this land for their livelihood. Let's look at some of the data from the 1870 U.S. Agricultural Census to see how they varied. These are crop yields from the 1870 census for each landholder, arranged from west to east based on their location on the map. Notice that Phipps' main crop was tobacco. Tobacco likes well-drained soils with relatively level land. Weems, on the other hand, is producing about half the tobacco that Phipps produced, and Mary Brogden produces no tobacco at all. Instead, she relies on livestock and corn primarily used probably as animal feed, as does Weems in this case. So Weems looks sort of like a hybrid strategy compared to Phipps and Brogden. This case nicely sets up our basic hypothesis that A, there are different definable strategies and B, that the specific land characteristics influence those strategies. Once we've established a larger sample size, we plan to use k-means analysis to categorize the main strategies employed and the variables that determine them. At times, I'm not sure that what we're doing is achievable, as we've had to modify our protocol several times. But as Jim likes to remind me, it wouldn't be research if we knew what we were doing. And we have learned some things so far that are worth mentioning. One deals with the inconsistency between land records and the agricultural census that raises some questions. We have found some instances where the acreage listed in the agricultural schedule differs from that of the deeds associated with some farms. Also, before 1880, the agricultural schedules do not delineate between landowners and tenants. This presents a problem in matching farm plats to the census records. Fixing these situations requires looking at the population schedules and doing some genealogical research on the owners. In our case study, for example, despite the fact that Mary Brogdon owned 220 acres, she never appears in the agricultural census. Harry, her son, who had been a Confederate Army officer, is the only Brogdon that shows up in the 1870 and 1880 agricultural census, despite the fact that the land was never conveyed to him. The population census schedules shed some light on this situation. These snapshots from the population census show where Mary lived during each census period. In 1860, she lived with her husband and children at Rowdown. However, in 1870, she lived with her daughter, Mary, and son-in-law, Daniel Murray, on a tract just south of Mary's main land holdings. Then, in 1880, the census has her living with her son, Harry, and younger sister, Elizabeth Stevenson. It's not clear what happened. Our working assumption is that Mary fell ill sometime before 1870 and Harry took over the farm, though it was never conveyed to him. There are other instances such as this that require us to clean up the data before we can conduct our analysis. We've also found that land transactions during this period were complicated and record keeping was inconsistent at best. Our initial assumption that we could recreate deeds and match them to the agricultural schedule by landowner proved invalid. Farms were created from multiple tracts over time, and land speculation also took place. Finding some property descriptions requires searching court records, which are not available online making it impossible to research during the COVID period. Some conveyances were not recorded in a timely manner or may not have been recorded at all. Details provided by surveyors' descriptions of the meets and bounds in some early cases are too general, limiting our ability to model the plat. For those that we do have good descriptions of, georeferencing them to the current tax map isn't guaranteed, especially in highly developed areas. This is still a project very much under construction, but we have made some good progress. Where do we go from here? This slide shows some of the steps that we plan to take. For the foreseeable future, our effort will continue to focus on researching land records to increase our sample size. Once that's done, we can begin integrating the geographical and tabular data for our analysis, and ultimately we plan to publish a journal paper and make the data available for other research inquiries. There are several other contributors on this project listed here that I want to acknowledge. All are citizen scientist volunteers with the Smithsonian Environmental Archaeology Lab, and without their help, we would not have made it this far. In closing, if I had to sum up my experience on this project so far in just one sentence, it would be this quote from Buckminster Fuller: "How often I found where I should be going, only by setting out for somewhere else." The direction of our project has changed several times as we've learned new information and overcome certain obstacles. It has been an educational and rewarding experience, and the destination is becoming clearer as we move along. I hope we've given you a good feel for what we're attempting to do with this project. We think the methodology has other applications in archaeology, and we'd be happy to discuss them with you. Thanks for listening.